James Whitmore had always believed that the most incredible stories were not found in books, but in real life. His years in law enforcement had exposed him to hidden truths, moments of triumph and injustice, and the weight of unraveled fates. This was no ordinary morning. It was the beginning of a justice story that would shake Riverton to its core. He had spent 2 decades witnessing the system's failures and successes. But today, he was stepping into the unknown, an undercover mission to uncover the true culture of the precinct he had just been appointed to lead. This would not just be another interesting story. It was a test of his leadership, his patience, and his principles. Dressed in worn jeans and a faded plaid shirt, he entered the Riverton precinct, his face unfamiliar to those who should have respected him the most. The air buzzed with casual chatter, the clinking of coffee mugs, and the rustling of paperwork. But beneath the surface, something darker lingered. James watched the officers interact, noting their camaraderie, but also the subtle hierarchy that dictated who commanded respect and who was dismissed. "Hey, you!" A sharp voice cut through the room. James turned to see Brian Carter, a broad-shouldered officer with a smirk that carried years of unchecked arrogance. The man didn't see a police chief. He saw someone beneath him. "You lost." Carter sneered, stepping closer. "This isn't a shelter." James clenched his jaw, suppressing the urge to reveal himself immediately. Before he could respond, Carter's smirk widened. Without warning, he spat at James. Laughter erupted from the onlookers. The room buzzed with amusement. But James stood still, wiping his face with a handkerchief. Justice stories weren't just about what happened in the streets. They began in places like this, with moments like this. Without a word, he turned and walked away. Minutes later, the intercom crackled. All personnel to the briefing room. As James stepped onto the podium, the laughter faded. "Good morning," he said, his voice unwavering. "My name is James Whitmore, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." Some of the most emotional stories are not just told, but lived. Real-life stories of injustice, redemption, and hidden truths shape the world around us. In Riverton, one such justice story was unfolding. It wasn't just another case. It was a battle for integrity within the very institution meant to uphold the law. This was a fictional audio story meant to lull someone into sleep. It was reality. Unraveled fates were at stake. And Chief James Whitmore was about to challenge a deeply embedded culture that had gone unchecked for too long. As the newly appointed police chief, James had expected resistance, but what he had seen firsthand that morning had confirmed his worst fears. Brian Carter, a veteran officer in the precinct, had not only disrespected him, but had shown a level of arrogance and racism that could not be ignored. Worse still, others had laughed, reinforcing a culture where such behavior was tolerated. Standing at the podium in the briefing room, James looked across the sea of officers. Some were still piecing together what was happening, while others, like Carter, had already realized they were in trouble. "I walked into this precinct today as an outsider," James began, his voice firm. "Not as your chief, but as an observer. What I witnessed was unacceptable." A murmur rippled through the crowd. William Adams, a senior officer known for his integrity, nodded approvingly from the side. He, too, had seen the signs of corruption but had lacked the authority to address them. That was about to change. James continued, "This department is supposed to stand for justice. Yet, some of you have forgotten what that means. As of today, that changes." He let the silence hang. Sarah Mitchell, a young officer who had once admired Carter, shifted uncomfortably. She had seen his behavior, but had never spoken up. Now, she realized silence made her complicit. "Brian Carter," James called out, his gaze locking onto the officer. "You're suspended, effective immediately." Gasps filled the room. Amazing stories of change don't happen overnight. But today, Riverton had taken its first step toward reform. James Whitmore stood at the front of the briefing room, his gaze sweeping over the officers gathered before him. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of his words from earlier still lingering. He had walked into this precinct expecting challenges, but what he had witnessed firsthand that morning had gone beyond mere resistance. It had exposed a culture of arrogance and disregard for basic human decency. He took a slow breath, placing both hands on the podium. "I came into this department unannounced because I wanted to see the reality of this place. not the rehearsed version. What I found was unacceptable. The room remained silent, though he could feel the unease settling in. Among the officers, Brian Carter sat stiffly, his usual smug confidence replaced with something colder. The man had made his position clear earlier, treating James with blatant disrespect, assuming he was just another nobody who didn't belong. What Carter hadn't realized then was that the man he had spat on was the very person who would decide his fate. William Adams stood near the back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had been in the department for years, long enough to see the decline in discipline and respect. But now, for the first time, there was someone in leadership who was willing to address it. James knew Adams was watching, waiting to see if he would follow through on his words. James turned his focus back to the room. Effective immediately, Officer Carter is suspended pending an internal investigation. Let this be clear, this is not personal. This is about integrity. This is about rebuilding the trust that this department has lost. A ripple of shock spread across the faces of many. Some exchanged glances, while others looked down, avoiding his gaze. Sarah Mitchell, a young officer, shifted uncomfortably. She had once admired Carter's confidence, but today had forced her to question everything. She had remained silent for too long. James continued, his voice steady. This is not a warning. This is a promise. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today. The silence that followed told him that change had begun. James Whitmore sat at his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically against a wooden surface as he reviewed the case files in front of him. His first few days as Riverton's police chief had been anything but ordinary. The events of that morning still played in his mind. The blatant disrespect, the unchecked arrogance, the deep-seated toxicity that had been allowed to take root in the department for far too long. Change wouldn't come easy, but James had never been one to back down from a fight worth having. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. William Adams stepped in, his usual composed demeanor intact. "Chief," he said, closing the door behind him, "you made quite an impression this morning." James exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't aiming for theatrics, but I needed to set the tone." Adams nodded. Some of them needed to hear it, especially Carter. Brian Carter had spent years embodying everything wrong with the department. He had used his badge not as a tool for justice, but as a shield for his own unchecked power. His behavior had gone ignored for too long, either brushed aside or outright excused by those unwilling to confront it. That ended today. His suspension wasn't just about accountability. It was a message to every officer in that room that things were going to change. James motioned to the files on his desk. "I need a full review of Carter's history. Complaints, misconduct reports, anything that was ignored." Adams gave a knowing nod. "I'll have it on your desk by tomorrow morning." As Adams left, James found himself thinking about Sarah Mitchell. The young officer had been visibly shaken during the meeting, her usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. She was at a crossroads, caught between the culture she had been conditioned to accept and the change that was now being demanded. He would keep an eye on her. People like Mitchell could make or break this transition. The question was, would she have the courage to choose the right side? James Whitmore sat in his office, his hands clasped together as he stared out the window at the Riverton Police Department parking lot. The precinct was quieter than usual, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted earlier that week, when he had made it clear that things were about to change. The suspension of Brian Carter had sent shockwaves through the department, but James knew that one action alone wouldn't be enough to fix years of corruption and unchecked misconduct. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. William Adams stepped inside, holding a thick file in his hand. "You asked for a full review on Carter," Adams said, placing the file on James's desk. "It's worse than we thought." James opened the folder and scanned the pages, his expression tightening with each line he read. Excessive force complaints, multiple accusations of harassment, and an unsettling number of disciplinary actions that had mysteriously been dismissed or buried over years. It was clear Carter had been protected by the system, by complacency, and by those who either feared him or agreed with his methods. James exhaled slowly. This department has been broken for a long time. Adams nodded, and it won't be easy to fix. A lot of officers are watching, waiting to see how serious you are about this. James leaned back in his chair, considering his next move. I need to start meeting with them. The ones who are willing to change. I can't do this alone. Adams hesitated for a moment before speaking. Mitchell asked to talk to you. James raised an eyebrow. Sarah Mitchell? Yes, Adams confirmed. I think she's starting to see things differently. That was promising. Mitchell had always been a by-the-book officer, but she had also been part of the culture that had allowed officers like Carter to thrive. If she was questioning things now, it meant others might be as well. Send her in, James said, closing Carter's file. Let's see if she's ready to be part of the solution. James Whitmore sat across from Sarah Mitchell in his office, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. The young officer looked uneasy, her fingers nervously tapping against the edge of her chair. It wasn't often that officers willingly stepped forward to acknowledge the flaws within their department, but James could see in her eyes that she was struggling with something deeper than just professional obligation. I appreciate you coming in, Officer Mitchell, James said, his voice calm but firm. I hear you have something to say. She nodded slowly, glancing down at her hands before looking back up at him. Sir, she hesitated, taking a deep breath. I need to be honest. I've been part of this culture. Not directly, maybe, but by staying quiet, by not questioning things when I should have. James studied her for a moment, giving her space to continue. She swallowed hard before continuing. I saw things, Chief. I heard things. Officers like Carter, they weren't subtle about the way they treated certain people. And I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that speaking up wouldn't change anything. James leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. But now you think differently? Mitchell nodded. After what happened with Carter, I started looking back on all the things I ignored. The comments, the treatment of civilians who didn't fit the mold. I don't want to be that kind of officer. I joined the force because I wanted to help people. But somewhere along the way, I let myself believe that staying quiet was the same as staying neutral. James exhaled, feeling a sense of cautious hope. It wasn't easy for officers to admit when they had been complicit in a broken system, but this was a step in the right direction. You have a choice, Mitchell, James said. You can pretend none of this happened and keep your head down like so many before you, or you can be part of the change we need. Her jaw tightened with determination. I want to be part of the change, Chief. James nodded. Then let's get to work. James Whitmore sat in his office, reviewing the files of disciplinary actions taken since his arrival in Riverton. The precinct was changing, slowly but undeniably. Officers like Brian Carter, who had once wielded unchecked authority, were facing consequences for their actions, while those willing to change, like Sarah Mitchell, were stepping forward to build a better department. But the work was far from over. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Come in, James said. William Adams stepped inside, his usual composed demeanor intact. Chief, I thought you wanted an update on Carter's appeal. James sighed and leaned back in his chair. Let me guess, he's still claiming he was unfairly targeted. Adams nodded. He's saying his suspension was politically motivated, that we're making an example out of him instead of following proper procedure. His attorney is pushing for a review of past cases, arguing that we're enforcing a double standard. James let out a dry chuckle. A double standard? The irony is almost amusing. He rubbed his temple before straightening in his chair. What do we have on him beyond the incident with me? Adams handed over a folder. Internal Affairs completed their investigation. Carter's history isn't clean. Excessive force complaints, unreported civilian confrontations, and a pattern of discriminatory behavior that was either ignored or brushed aside. It's all here. James flipped through the documents, his jaw tightening. This department enabled him for too long. He assumed he was untouchable because no one held him accountable. Adams folded his arms. That's changing now. James nodded. Yes, it is. And Carter can fight his appeal all he wants, but he won't win. This isn't just about one officer. It's about setting a precedent. If we let this slide, we send a message that nothing has truly changed. Adams gave a small, approving nod. Then I'll make sure this case is handled properly. As Adams left, James glanced out his office window. The precinct still had a long way to go, but today it was one step closer to being the department it needed to be. James Whitmore had always believed that real-life stories held the most power. They weren't just words on a page. They were experiences, lessons, and in many cases, hidden truths waiting to be uncovered. As he sat in his office, reviewing reports from the past few weeks, he realized he was at the center of one of those incredible stories, one of justice stories that people would remember. His arrival in Riverton had unraveled fates, exposing the flaws within the department. It was a transformation that many resisted, but change was inevitable. The events of the past month had been nothing short of amazing stories in the making. Officer Brian Carter, once untouchable, now found himself suspended and under investigation. His appeal loomed, and while James knew the fight wasn't over, he also knew that accountability was no longer optional. William Adams, his most trusted officer, had assured him that the case against Carter was solid. The hidden truths buried in Carter's record had finally surfaced. Years of unchecked misconduct, complaints brushed aside, and a pattern of discrimination that had been ignored for far too long. "Chief, I have some updates," Adams said as he walked into the office. James looked up, nodding for him to continue. "The review board has denied Carter's appeal. His misconduct, especially in light of his actions toward you, was deemed severe enough to warrant termination." James exhaled, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Good. This isn't about revenge. It's about setting the right precedent." Adams nodded. "We're already seeing a shift. Officers are starting to think twice before acting out. And Sarah Mitchell, she came to me yesterday, asking how she can help a community outreach. She says she wants to be part of the solution." That brought a small, rare smile to James's face. Then maybe there's hope for real change. As Adams left, James leaned back in his chair. This story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And one day, maybe this would be one of those interesting stories people told to remind others that justice, no matter how delayed, always found its way. James Whitmore had always believed in the power of real-life stories. They had the ability to shape perceptions, challenge norms, and bring about real change. His own journey in Riverton had quickly turned into one of those incredible stories, filled with hidden truths and justice stories that needed to be told. It was a kind of tale that would one day be recorded as an audio story, a lesson in leadership, accountability, and integrity. Some might call one of those amazing stories of transformation. Others might see it as a story of power and corruption finally being confronted. Either way, it was unfolding before his eyes, and he was at the center of it. Brian Carter, once a dominant force in the precinct, now found himself at the losing end of his own arrogance. His behavior had been exposed, and his appeal had been denied. James knew that no single action could fix the years of damage done, but this was a necessary step. Riverton's police force had been plagued with a toxic culture for too long, and the unraveling of its fate had begun with one moment of disrespect. One decision that had forced James to take a stand. As he walked through the station, James could feel the shift. Conversations were quieter, more measured. Officers who had once laughed alongside Carter now avoided eye contact. But the most interesting story of all was Sarah Mitchell. She had come to him just days before, expressing her desire to be part of the solution. "I want to make things right," she had said, her voice firm with conviction. James had seen it before. Officers who realized too late that they had been complicit in something much bigger than themselves. But for the first time, he believed it wasn't just words. Unraveled fates had led them to this moment, and James knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But real justice wasn't about comfort. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. James Whitmore had spent his entire career hearing real-life stories of corruption and injustice, but none had felt as personal as this one. His arrival in Riverton was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter for the town's police department. Yet what he uncovered instead was one of those hidden truths buried beneath years of unchecked power. It was a kind of justice story that people only whispered about, a reality that had been ignored for too long. As he navigated the department's deep-rooted issues, it felt like one of those incredible stories that people would one day turn into audio stories, a cautionary tale for future generations. Brian Carter had ruled the precinct with an iron grip, his arrogance disguised as authority, his bias masked under the guise of protocol. His downfall, however, was of his own making. What started as a moment of unchecked cruelty had unraveled the fate of an entire department. The officers who once stood by him were now silent, their loyalties shifting as they realized the tide was turning. Carter's suspension sent a message, but James knew it was only the first step. As James walked through the station, he noticed Sarah Mitchell sitting at her desk, her expression serious. Unlike Carter, she had chosen to reflect on her role in the precinct's past culture. "I never thought about how much we let slide," she admitted. "We laughed, we looked away. We never stopped to think about the harm it caused." James nodded, knowing this was the start of her redemption. Some stories of transformation weren't dramatic, but they were necessary. William Adams, ever the steady force in the department, met James in his office later that day. "You made an impact today," he said, crossing his arms. "It won't be easy, but it's a start." James exhaled, looking out at the precinct. Unraveled fates had led them here, but the story was far from over. Change wasn't instant, and justice wasn't always simple. But this time it would be real. One of the most valuable lessons from this story is that true leadership is built on integrity, courage, and accountability. James Whitmore didn't step into his role as police chief to command fear. He came to inspire respect and demand justice. His experience reminds us that change is never easy, especially when confronting long-standing issues like discrimination and abuse of power. Yet, real progress begins when one person dares to challenge the status quo. For older audiences, this lesson resonates deeply. Many have witnessed injustices over the years, some spoken about, others ignored. But silence only allows wrongdoing to persist. Whether in our families, communities, or workplaces, we all have a role to play in upholding fairness and dignity. Sometimes that means standing firm against mistreatment, even when it's uncomfortable. Other times, it means guiding younger generations, teaching them to choose kindness over cruelty, fairness over favoritism. James Whitmore's story is a reminder that character is defined not by words, but by actions. As we grow older, our legacy is not just in what we achieve, but in how we inspire others to lead with honesty and compassion.